In this video, we'll explore the use of SQL constraints and how they help maintain integrity in a database using SQL Server Management Studio. Let's go. All right, guys, let's jump right into constraints. So constraints, as the name implies, are restrictions or rules placed on a table or fields in a table to maintain data integrity or referential integrity, and they're typically included at the time that a table is created. So let's jump right in. Let's see what that looks like in practice. So we'll create a database. Create database. I'm just going to call this company DB. This will be a database for a fictitious company. Now let's select everything from sys.databases, see that our database is in there, so we can see that company DB database in there. Let's go ahead and use that database. We'll say use company DB. And now let's create our first table. So the first table will be our departments table. So create table departments. First field will be department ID with a data type of int, and then we'll have department name with a data type of varchar 100. And the first constraint I'd like to introduce is the primary key. A primary key is a unique identifier for a table, and it's essentially the combination of two constraints, unique and not null. It's not just the combination of unique and not null for a couple of reasons I'll get into, but first I'd like to just show how a constraint is written. It's written right in line with the field declaration here. So for a primary key, we would just write primary key like that. Okay, and that makes that field the primary key of this table. So again, it's essentially a combination of unique and not null, and you'll notice the notation here is rather self-explanatory. Unique means that every record in that field must be unique. Not null means that no null values are allowed. Now, it's not the same. One reason is because there can only be one primary key in a table, so something like this would be prohibited, whereas unique and not null, we can write in every field, so something like this is perfectly fine. Another reason is that a primary key automatically creates an index for a table. And I'm not getting into indexes in this tutorial, but just to say an index is a way for a database to quickly and efficiently search through a table. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this. Did I spell all of this correctly? Okay. And let's go ahead and select everything from information schema.tables, and then we should see that table in there, so we can see our departments table. Okay. And so now let's create a record. Let's insert a record into this table. Let's say insert into departments values, and we'll insert values in the order of the fields. So department ID first, department name second. First department ID will be 1, and I'm just going to call this the finance department. Run this, and now if we select everything from departments, we'll see that record in there, right? We have that record. Okay, now let's test this constraint. So remember, with primary key, it must be unique and not null. So what happens if we try to pass in a null value? We get an error. And this is the essence of a constraint. It's constraining the insertion of this value that goes against the nature of the constraint, right? So another property of primary key, so to speak, would be unique. So all the values in that field must be unique. So what happens if we try to pass in 1 again, a duplicate, run that, and again we get an error. Cannot insert duplicate key. All right, so we can see the constraint working there. So let's insert a proper record in here. Second department will be personnel. Run that. And now if we select everything from departments, we'll see that second record in there. Okay, so now let's create another table, and this will be our employees table. So first field will be employee ID, data type of int, then employee name, data type varchar. And what I'll do here is I'll create all of the fields, and I'll go back in a second and put in the constraints. So email, salary, this will be decimal, so 10, 2, and then we'll have a department ID, and data type int, and then date of hire, data type date. All right, so our first constraint in this table will be the primary key, and we'll put that into the employee ID, primary key. The employee name, we want that to be not null, right? We don't want an employee with no name. The email will be unique. And in salary, I'll introduce another constraint. It's called default. And so default will add a value, a default value, if no value is indicated in the insertion. So we'll say default to 50,000. Okay. I'll skip department ID for now, go to date of hire, and here I'll introduce another constraint. It's called check, and this checks the value against a condition. And so the condition that we want here is for the date of hire to be past a certain date. We'll pretend this is the date that the company was created, so we couldn't have hired somebody before the company was created. So we'll say this is 2020-0101. The format here is year, month, day. Let's go back to department ID. And here I'll introduce another constraint called a foreign key. A foreign key establishes a relationship between this table and another table. It requires that every value inserted into this table, into this field, match a field in the other table, typically that other table's primary key. Okay, so say in the departments table right now we have two IDs, number 1 and 2. So if we were to try to insert a value that are not one or 2, then we would see an error. Okay, and so the way that we write a foreign key would be references, and then we'll give it the name of the table, department or departments, and then the field, department ID. Okay, just like that. All right. One interesting thing to note here is that we've established a relationship between this table and the departments table, but what happens if the departments table changes in some way? Say the department is deleted. So what happens with all of the records in the employees table that are associated with that department? Well, we would want those deleted as well. And so the way that we would do that is to say on delete cascade. And so if a department is deleted, all the records in the employee table associated with that department are deleted as well. Now, what if a department that's associated with employees in the employee table is not deleted but just updated? So we can handle that as well. We can say on update cascade, and that will update all of the records in the employee table associated with the department that's been updated. Okay. Last thing before we move on to test all of these constraints is I'd just like to note that there's a different way to write the primary key and the foreign key, and that is at the end of this block. So we can write it, the primary key, we can write it like this, and then we can pass in the field, right? Employee ID, like that. And the same thing for the foreign key, we can say foreign key, and then we can move this down like that, and then we have to give it the field as well. So here it's department ID, right? Like that. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this, and then we can select everything from information schema.tables, and we'll see that employees table in there. So let's go ahead and create our first record. So we'll insert into employees, values, and so this will be employee number 1. Name will be John Doe. Email will be jd@company.com. Salary, let's just give them 60,000. Department ID will be 1, and the date of hire will be 2020-01-02. Let's go ahead and run this. And now if we select everything from employees, we'll see that record in there, right? Okay, so now let's go ahead and test this constraint. Do this. So again, with the primary key, must be not null, unique. So we've done this already, but let's do it again. Null, we get that constraint working. And then here, if we try to put in a duplicate, we'll have that constraint working as well. So now John Doe must be not null. So what happens if we try to pass in a null value, we get that constraint. So now let's put in a proper name here. Let's say Jane Smith. Now with the email, it must be unique. So what happens if we try to run this, we'll get an error as well. So we'll change that. And then I'll skip the salary for now. We'll test that in a second. Now let's test this foreign key. Again, the values here must match values in the departments table. So we have values 1 and 2 for department ID. So what happens if we try to pass in 3 and we get that error, right? We get that constraint working. All right, so now let's do 2. And then with the check constraint, the date must be past January 1st, 2020. So what if we just say 2019 here, and we'll get that constraint working there as well. All right, so let's change this back, run this, and then that ran, select everything from employees, and we see that second record in there. Okay, so now let's go back and test that default constraint. So what I'll do is I'll delete this record we just created, delete from employees, where employee ID is 2. Run that, and now if we select everything, we'll see that record's been deleted. And now what we'll do is we'll tell it exactly what values we're passing in, and we'll leave out the salary and see that default constraint in action. So we'll say employee ID, employee name, email, skip salary, go to department ID, department ID, and then date of hire. Okay, and then here we're going to delete this value, run this, and we can see it ran fine. And if we select everything from employees, we'll see that 50,000 value from the default constraint. All right, so now I'd like to check the delete on cascade, or on delete cascade and on update cascade. So let's update first. So what happens if we update the departments table? We'll say update departments, set department ID to 3, where department ID is 2. So we're updating the department ID 2 to 3. So run this. And now when we select everything from employees, that employee that was assigned to department ID 2 will now show department ID 3, right? And we can see that there. Okay. Now what happens if we delete that department number 3? So we'll say delete from departments, where department ID is 3. Run that. And now when we select everything from employees, that record will be gone, right? Okay guys, that does it for constraints. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that was helpful. If it was, please like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.